So good afternoon. I'm Rehana Masters, your moderator for our webinar today. And we're looking at the evolution of digital rights in Africa, reflecting on the last 10 years and visualizing the next 10 years. So I just wanted to say that this webinar is a collaborative effort between the NMT Media Foundation, formerly Namibia Media Trust, and the Association for Progressive Communications. It's part of the ongoing activities for 2024. And today we have Koliwe Majama and Edison Ojo, who will be speaking to their recently completed research. And that's the reason we're meeting here. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our panelists. Zimbabwean digital rights activist Koliwe Majama was one of the first coordinators of the AFDEC Secretariat. And so she's been grounded in their work, in the work undertaken by the APC for quite some time. And of course, is very aware of the topical digital rights issues for some time. Koliwe has over 15 years experience working with civil society in Africa, advocating for media and internet freedom across the globe. She will be speaking to her research, which is titled 10 Years of Building a Movement for Digital Rights in Africa, Impact of the African Declaration on Rights and Freedom, Internet Freedoms in Africa. Edison Ojo, I know for many, he's a household name. He is one of the crafters of the African Declaration on Internet Rights and Freedoms and has contributed to numerous policy frameworks on the continent. Along with several other colleagues, and in particular, Gilbert Sindigwa and Zoe Titus, Edith was at the finish line in pushing for the United Nations General Assembly to declare September 28th the International Day for Universal Access to Information. He has dedicated over 2 decades to promoting and defending freedom of expression, not just in Nigeria, but in the continent and globally. Today, the questions he will be responding to will test his institutional memory, but it will also speak to his research on the emerging issues on digital rights in Africa. Also, let me just introduce my colleague for this webinar, Peace Oliver Amuge, the Africa Regional Lead at APC, who's going to give you a brief overview of the APC and the activities they've been engaged in the last few months. So over to you, Peace.
Thanks very much, Rian, and hi, everyone. I apologize that I won't turn my video on. I have just had a power backlog, so I'll try to save my charge. So thank you very much for honoring our invite and joining this webinar. We're very excited. And on behalf of the AFDEC Secretariat, I would just like to briefly just share with you a few things that we have been up to. And quickly to go to it, we have been having a couple of engagements. And as you might be aware that the declaration turns 10 years since its launch, which is such a big milestone, and we've been very excited about it. We've had a couple of engagements. We've had meetings with members from December last year, and this year we had also an opportunity to meet in person in Accra during the Digital Rights Inclusion Forum that happened in Accra. And so when we met, we talked about several initiatives that we could do to celebrate, to reflect, to rejoice, to map, on some of the challenges of stock take, and also to reflect on the opportunities that lies ahead with this declaration. This was with the coalition members, and if anyone here does not know about the AFDEC coalition, it is African Declaration on Internet Rights and Freedoms Coalition, which we always call it AFDEC. And so during these engagements, we came up with a couple of things to do. For instance, mapping out some of the regional events, mapping out some of the emerging issues that came up, and this was done through the members, through the lists, and we had really very insightful issues that we brought up. And also we talked about having this kind of events, webinars, and having engagements during regional events. For instance, during the 5th Africa in September in Dakar, we had an opportunity to hold a session that was stock taking on AFDEC, and we had very crucial engagements. We had members of AFDEC present in this session. Yes, so we had an opportunity to listen to other civil society organizations in the region that have used the declaration. And so that was a session that we had there. We also had an opportunity to organize a session, a side event at the African Investigative Journalism Conference that happened last month in Joburg, still reflecting and having this similar kind of engagement. And also some of the things that the coalition members wanted to do was to document, have an opportunity to document all these resources, these reflections, and some of the things that might have flipped off our mind. We had an opportunity actually during the Fifth Africa session to go through, the process that the people that drafted the declaration went through, and this was quite informative for some of us that are using the declaration, and some of the members that were there that used the declaration that did not know about this. And so we're very happy to have this. And another key thing that the members wanted to do was to do a research, to stock take and research to also look at some of the emerging issues, and so today we're very excited to have this opportunity to listen to some of the findings that the researchers would share with us. And so I want to just give a big thanks to all of you who have made it here, and the Namibia Media Trust and APC and the Secretariat of AFDEC and the members of AFDEC. So I will just end here, Rihanna, and thank you.
Thanks for that piece. And, without further ado, let's just kind of dive in. Before we start the conversation with our two panelists, let me just give you a run through. I'll be asking questions pertaining to the research, but also, a general overview questions. And then we want to have, although your mics will be off, we want to have an interactive session. So please feel free to put through your questions or comments on the chat channel, and I will definitely pick up on it. We will then at some point open it up after the facilitated conversation, and the next, sort of 30, 40, we're not sure how long it'll be, but about 30 to 45 minutes, we'll focus on what next, what do we do? And my colleague Peace will facilitate that session. And this is where we invite you to contribute as well, because really I guess it's an, sort of a brainstorming session with all of us involved. Anyway, let me start with Koliwe. Having read your paper and, really starting at the basic point, when the African Declaration on Internet Rights and Freedoms was launched in 2015, what was firstly the motivation and secondly the intention?
Thanks for your question, Rihanna. I believe that, just looking at the movement as a whole, and I think in the paper, I do attribute the AFDEC coalition as the first coordinated digital rights movement. And in the paper, you'll find that I've done quite an expansive outline on the trends that had been happening in the region in terms of, continued proposal of or enactment of repressive laws, the increase in digital authoritarianism. We had arrests in Egypt, and also we had a very active citizen who was interacting, whether it was for mobilizing online, whether it was for organizing or accessing information, or simply, just having a platform where they can speak on a number of issues, whether they were socio-economic or political within the region. And so I think there was general consensus from the beginning that there was supposed to be a standard setting tool that would respond to those internet and tech related developments at both national and regional level. One of the things that I noted also, which is of significance, and when you look at the 23 organizations that started off with the initial drafting process, is that these were long-standing very senior, very activist, dedicated people who had already been looking at issues relating to freedom of expression, access to information, but chiefly in relation to the media. And I think that there was an acknowledgement that there was a transformation of the media sector from just traditional broadcast and print media to a more technologically advanced or an internet powered platform that began to change, the face of journalism for being restricted to only cool people like myself who had the privilege of sharing information or sharing the agenda. So I would say that was definitely one of the motivation. It was a response to digital authoritarianism and also just the emerging trends. Governments were beginning to see how much citizens could mobilize themselves, and they were already beginning to respond with the repressive internet laws.
So, Edith, I'll come across to you. You were one of the many people who walked the first steps of that journey of developing the declaration. But as Koliwe has already alluded, it was the first sort of digital rights coalition. However, it had a springboard from which it was launched. So I'd like you to lay a foundation of the policy frameworks that came before. You were actually involved in the development of some of them, and show how that influenced the conceptualization and development of the declaration.
Thank you very much, Rihanna, and I hope you can hear me clearly. I think we need to situate this in 2013 when the conversation started about developing some sort of guidance for policymaking, advocacy, lawmaking, and all the rest. And at that time, it was clear that there was no comprehensive normative framework for digital rights on the continent. And we were seeing a lot of governments in different countries beginning to adopt laws. And some of the provisions of those laws were very worrisome because not only were they not properly informed, in many cases, these laws were simply being taken from other jurisdictions and with little adaptation to contextualize them. They were being adopted and enforced in different countries. So we started a conversation about providing some guiding framework to help policymakers on the continent have a better understanding of the issues, but also to guide them on what they should take into account in their lawmaking and policymaking processes, but also to assist civil society and other stakeholders engaged in advocacy work about what the normative standards were. So that was sort of the context in which this started. And non-controversial, it was imperative that the principles that were adopted were already fairly well established so that we're not really creating any new human rights standards, but really adapting existing human rights norms and standards. And this also rode on the back of the 2012 resolution that was adopted by the UN Human Rights Council to the effect that the rights which apply offline should also apply and be enjoyed online. So taking that principle, we started to look at a number of norms and standards that had been established at the UN level within the African region, and in some cases in national context and by experts such as the UN Special Rapporteur and the ACHPR Special Rapporteur. So those were sort of the standards that we looked to, and in particular, looking at the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which admittedly is very thin on the issue of digital rights and really did not capture a whole range of issues, including, for instance, the right to privacy. So we had to look onto other documents, look onto some judicial decisions, and all of this provided the basis of the principles, the 13 principles that were collated, and after a series of consultations and conversations, formed the declaration. So you would see that we make the point that it's built on a heritage of human rights advocacy on the African continent because we drew a lot of inspiration from the fact that the World Press Freedom Day had its origins on the African continent, and that we could equally develop a normative framework, which we may call African, but would stand the test of time all over the globe. And I think we can say with some satisfaction that we're able to achieve that because the declaration itself inspired a number of efforts in other regions of the world. And for those who have followed it closely, was really endorsed by global multilateral bodies, bilateral institutions, as well as national governments. Thank you, Brianna.
So that brings me to the next question for both of you, actually. So, advocates, when they're doing in their work, guiding their work around the 13 principles that you refer to quite often, and that really are the foundation of the declaration. How do advocates navigate that balancing act of, CSO expectations and desire, and that of governments, which at times are the same, but on other occasions they differ greatly?
Thanks, and I'll take that. I'll take that to give it a break. I think what the declaration does is set the grounding or the key issues or the concept. So when you look at the 13th declaration, if, for instance, you're looking at access to information or internet access and affordability, it gives you the broader framework. But I think what is of actual value to the declaration is the application. Now, you'll see that within the application of the declaration, if you go on the site, the Secretariat has, made a lot of efforts to sort of track the work that people are doing, especially at national or sub-regional level. So AFDEC Coalition's membership cuts across the region, even though the Secretariat do admit that within North and Central Africa, they don't have as much activity around digital rights. That is yet to improve. So having worked as a coordinator for the coalition, one of the things that is critical to note is context will be different. So, for instance, the nature of internet shutdowns over the years has varied. Some are blanket, some are partial. In that they would be, if you look at the case of Ethiopia, targeting a certain geography. If you look at the case of Zimbabwe, at the time they had an internet shutdown, it was restrictions on a specific web platform that Zimbabweans were putting in their ID details so that they can get their voter registration details. But when you look at the internet shutdown in Nigeria, that was specifically, the Twitter one, or the X as you'd like to call it now, was specifically targeted at that. So the challenge has been identifying which principle the issue that you are dealing with is going to be located. And sometimes you will find that there would be a parallel, for instance, in issues relating to, say, internet access, but also freedom of expression. And so I think over the years, what has been clear is that there's a variation in terms of the responses of the members, largely because there is not as much detail. So at some point, we need to start talking about the obligations of civil society organizations having access to the website to be able to increase the resources that are available for people to be able to latch on as they run their various campaigns. The second issue for me is the issue of governance. I find that over the years, just watching, say, for instance, responses by whether it was the AFDEC coalition in the lead or whether it was the AFDEC coalition supporting actions by a member, is that the governance structure, the experience and expertise of civil society organizations or tech players who are working on digital rights issues to understand where power lies within their mapping of a campaign. And that is what has brought about the variation. So as we go forward, the important thing is to actually acknowledge that the responses that we will get from members who are based in a country, in a sub-region such as West and Southern Africa, whose main or initial members were rooted, or where you have a more active civil society, the responses will be different. So people can only respond to a violation based on what it is that is available for them on the website in terms of resources for referencing. Thanks, Rihanna.
Thanks, Khulime.
Let
Before
me just try and come onto the issue from a slightly different perspective. Because the question you asked, I think, really goes back to one of the motivations behind this, which was the multi-stakeholder approach to internet governance. And again, going back to 2012, 2013, when these conversations were happening globally, it was very clear that at the international level, there had been wide acceptance of the notion of a multi-stakeholder approach to internet governance, but not so much on the African continent, where governments took the view that it was their exclusive prerogative to make laws and policies. And regardless of the fact, if we are to be honest, that governments were not the most knowledgeable stakeholder group on the continent in terms of digital rights issues, they nonetheless had the responsibility of lawmaking and policy making. So we had to try and break down this mindset that different stakeholder groups have different things to bring to the table when you're talking of providing guidance for the policy environment. And this is where I think it's important when I analyze your question about how we're navigating this, given the different priorities. For most governments, their priority is simply about security and protection, which are important. But for civil society, we often bring a human rights perspective. We always insist that the internet governance framework must be rights respecting, because at the end of the day, if you're trying to protect people by violating their rights, then a lot of people are going to find those protections meaningless. And the other argument we always made was that people shouldn't have to choose between protection and privacy or other human rights.
As he's getting on, I like the conversation he was starting, Rihanna, on multi-stakeholderism. And I think that it's a question that we should actually be asking ourselves on the extent to which what we have now as National Internet Governance Forum, whether we actually truly have a multi-stakeholder convening when we meet, and the extent to which they actually are effective in terms of coming up with positions on issues that come on board as people are going through the different deliberations at that level. On the issue of government priorities, I'm seeing that we also do have people from MISA online. Whether we like it or not, I've found that every time that you're interacting with government officials or, just like policymakers, you cannot run away from the politics of the day. So even when you look at the AFDIC coalition membership, you already know which organizations have over the years had a relationship with government or who have already got that rapport going in terms of getting your issues to them. So I think that was a very interesting conversation that Edith was bringing up.
So, like I was saying, we in this environment where we are trying to set standards, I think it's important that whilst government may be preoccupied with issues of protecting citizens and ensuring that laws are respected, it's also important that the voices of civil society are engaged in that process to insist that human rights norms and standards be respected in whatever actions and measures are being put in place for those protections. So there is always a tension here. And part of what the principles do is to try and provide guidance on how these issues should be navigated and what the considerations should be. And I think the application section, which Koliwe referred to and underscored earlier, is also an important part of that framework in demonstrating how in real life situations these principles can be applied. Thank you, Rihanna.
And thanks, Edith. Thanks, Koliwe and Edith. You've actually, laid the foundation, and I want to park the points that you raised about, the multi-stakeholders, who we bring into the room, how we're going to, continue when we go forward. So that, we'll park that for the later conversation, which is coming up. And then I want to say, okay, when you talked now, you basically were outlining CSOs and how they engage with the declaration. But how do you see it coming alive, from words on paper that are ideals to actual tangible rights that citizens, the public users can experience, embrace, and enjoy? How do we connect it? Can you make the connection?
I think the connections have already been made, Rihanna. When you look at the levels of engagement of members of the coalition and even outside the coalition in response to digital rights violations, but also I think chiefly their participation in law or policy or regulatory processes, whether it's at consultative phase, whether it's like, I know that some organizations who are represented here would come up with model laws that would borrow from the actual declaration or other broader human rights principles. I'll give an example, which I also cite in the paper, is the response that the coalition had to the COVID-19 pandemic. When there was that pandemic and the imposition of lockdowns, the coalition was broader enough to think or to see the work beyond the actual principles that they have come up with, but also looking at the UNESCO Internet Universality Indicators. And they came up with a framework that enabled members to assess the key rights on the continent. And I think when you look at those reflective articles that are on there, you can already see that some of the recommendations, even though it was a very short period of time, which is, I think, we were compiling that report in just a year. But when you look at some of the recommendations that were there, recommendations to policymakers, some of the recommendations even to the tech community. Now, as Idet was talking about multi-stakeholderism, I think that one of the key things is to actually underline that we still have a long way in terms of bringing in the tech community to have a conversation on human rights standards. But if you look at the proposals that were made in that booklet around privacy and personal data, I remember there were interesting issues around gender equality, as well as the development and access to knowledge. I think that was underlined because that was a big thing. The reactions by government to come up with the freedom of expression laws that were incorporated in some of the COVID-19 policies actually were in response to the fact that they were not proactively giving information to citizens. But you see a lot of those recommendations. The last thing for me is really looking at the work that has been done practically by coalition members at continental level, especially when you look at the African Commission. And in the interviews that I had with some of the members, one of the acknowledgements was that the reason why the coalition's work shine so brightly at continental level is that some of its earliest members have had the experience of working in those groupings. So if you look at the media rights agenda, and if you look at also, I think it's the University of Pretoria's Center for Human Rights, that has been supporting a technical partner of the Commission for over 20 years. So I think it's a lot of responding, but it's also proactively ensuring that there are provisions that are underlining those human rights.
Thanks, Koliwe.
So just to pick up from where Koliwe left off. So one of the first things that we did upon the adoption and launch of the declaration was to seek endorsements from various groupings and individuals. And one of them was the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which adopted Resolution 222 in May of 2012, essentially endorsing the declaration and, in fact, mandating the special rapporteur to use it as a framework for updating the Declaration of Principles on Freedom of Expression in Africa. That document had subsequently became one of the major inspirations behind many of the principles that are contained in the ACHPRO's Declaration of Principles. And both Isaac and myself were members of the expert group that was convened by the special rapporteur to assist in that process. And a lot of reference was made to this African declaration, such that many of the principles in the ACHPRO's document were actually inspired by that document. The other thing that I think is also important to mention, although I would say that at this point in time, we have not fully achieved all of the goals that were set in the beginning. But again, looking at the environment in which this declaration was developed and adopted, it was in an environment where many of those who were playing leadership roles on the continent really had little knowledge of digital rights. We talked about lawmaking, for instance. Many of our governments just didn't understand these issues. They neither understood the technology or how to make laws that took into account the technology. But the parliamentarians in particular were way behind in terms of their knowledge of digital rights issues and principles. So one of the targets we had set for ourselves was to engage with parliamentarians on the continent to build their capacity on digital rights issues so that going forward, their lawmaking processes and standards would be greatly enhanced. Unfortunately, I don't think we've been able to do that in the manner that we had envisaged. It was also important for us to engage with national human rights institutions because, again, they were playing a quasi-judicial role in terms of resolving human rights complaints that were being brought before them. And in the digital world, a lot of those issues related to digital rights issues, which they also did not have the capacity to navigate. We've been able to convene an engagement with digital human rights, with national human rights institutions on the continent, although I think that needs to be an ongoing process. The other stakeholder group that we've not been able to engage with, at least as an AFDEC coalition, although a number of AFDEC members have done that. Paradigm Initiative, for instance, has been engaging with the judiciary in Nigeria. But a lot of judges are deciding cases on digital rights issues where they have little or no knowledge. Many of them are people who were brought up in the analog age. Their training in law was really based on a different era, and they struggle to understand the digital rights era and issues. So again, it's important for us to find ways to engage with with judges and with the judiciary in our respective countries to give them a better understanding of these issues. How do they apply those principles that they've applied over the years offline in an online environment? And I think that this remains part of the task that we still need to fulfill looking to the future, because if we are really going to be able to achieve the digital rights environment that we desire, it's important that all of these groups that play different roles in the process, whether it's policy making, law making, enforcement, and so on, must have a good understanding of the issues. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that edit. And yes, in the conversation with peace, we can bring up the issue of including these other sectors, especially the judiciary, not just from interpretation of the law, but also in terms of e-justice and the way that is moving, and issues around, privacy and protection, of private information. So yes, that'll be a great sort of like where to next and what to do next. In your paper, well, first of all, Koliwe talked about how this declaration is a standard setting, document. And you also talk about how it remains highly relevant even now. So my question, but you do identify a long list of emerging issues. Could you, without, going through that long list, identify the ones that for you really are key?
So it's a bit of a challenge because as I listed in the paper, many of the coalition members who responded to the survey on what the emerging digital rights issues are for them had various perspectives. So we have quite a long list. And basically, I think at the end of the day, we have to do some selection. We have to make a choice as to what are the priorities in terms of these issues. But one issue that was completely off the radar 10 years ago was the issue of artificial intelligence. It's now a big issue. How does the declaration address that issue? I would say not at all. Again, the way that the declaration has been approached is based on development of principles that would apply in a human rights environment. So it's not specifically technology-based. It looks at applicable principles. So to an extent, those principles remain relevant. But with the emergence of new technologies, such as artificial intelligence, and the even elaboration of existing issues like data protection, for instance, which was, I think, in a different environment at that time than it is now, or the issue that Koliwe referenced around internet shutdown. Since then, there's been a lot of decisions coming from the courts, from international bodies, from experts about the status of intentional disruption of the internet and networks, which I think has fundamentally said that it is a violation of the right to freedom of expression, even though we don't yet have that as a human rights norm, but the principles all move in that direction. How do we then update the principles to take into account these new technologies, this elaboration of existing norms and standards that have happened over the last 10 years? I think that remains a huge conversation for us in taking forward the idea that 10 years later, we should be updating the declaration because many of the technologies that now exist did not exist at that time. And honestly, if I were to try and model what the future would look like, I would say that yes, we are looking to both positive and negative developments that we need to be responding to in updating the declaration. So one of the issues that we are clearly going to continue to experience is growth in internet penetration on the African continent. A major issue in the declaration was that of access and affordability, access to the internet and affordability of access, which at that time was, I think, one of the biggest issues for the African continent. So although it's an issue that you would say has a universal application, it was particularly stark for us given the low level of access and the high cost of access. So that is an issue that has been addressed, but I think it's evolving and we need to look at the current environment, how that might be impacted. But in the area of challenges, we're also looking at what Koliwe was referring to, digital authoritarianism, as many governments are, using surveillance the more to gather information, shutting down the internet, adopting restrictive laws, and so on. How do we respond to all of these issues? Are the current principles in the declaration robust enough to capture this new digital environment? How do we respond to the issue of data privacy? Again, we have both government and private sector collecting more data now than ever before. And we are now at a stage where everybody says data is the new currency, which really means that a lot of private companies are trading in personal data. How do we protect people's personal data in this new digital environment? Is the declaration robust enough, or do we need to update it? And the issue of digital inequality, that is also, they have digital divides across many different issues and sectors. So these are some of the emerging issues that we really need to grapple with and decide as a continent what are our priorities, because obviously, if we were to try and address all of the emerging issues, we'll likely be producing volumes and volumes of books, not a simple set of principles. Thank you.
Actually, Edith, you literally, sort of took the next question that I was going to ask around AI of both you and Koliwe. But anyway, moving on. In the conversation we had earlier at AIJC, where you were not present, Henriette talked about, she didn't think there was need to update the declaration, but looked more at the application. But when I listen to you and I, look at your paper and that of Koliwe's, I get a strong sense that we have to look at, revising or amending that declaration. Maybe you can both speak to that, and we can, that will be our sort of ending note.
So for me, I think just my findings, just talking to members and other people outside the coalition, is that there's general consensus that the outline, the principles themselves, they largely remain relevant. And Idette, I was just thinking as you were speaking, is one of the things that I noticed is that the declaration had foresight in that it spoke about technologies. And when you're talking about AI, you haven't explicitly said AI in the declaration. But if you think about technology, you know definitely that AI is a functioning of technological, of any system, is what the declaration is relating to. So in that regard, I think there are specific principles that I identify within my paper. There should be about six of them. The first one being, and I'll just share quickly, openness. And with the openness application, I think that there's need to actually break down and specific about the model ecosystem and talk about the key or trending issues about transparency, accountability, and innovation. I'll add security because I see that there was a lot of underlining of that when Idette was talking about that. And looking more wholesome at what we mean when we say an open internet. So you're looking at also at issues of open standards, of the technologies, but also interconnection and other issues to do with licensing. Then there's security and stability and I think resilience of the internet. That's where we now need to start talking or underlining more clearly issues about responsibilities of the tech companies and the builder community. And I saw Chennai is on this call. One of the big things is embedding ethics in the design of technologies that's going to be, distributed. And she used to underline a lot of this, especially when you look at issues to do with smart cities, but also the extent to which those systems are making decisions. So I give an example in the paper of the South African social welfare system. There's a research that was done on the social welfare system on how those decision-making processes are actually excluding other people, but issues also about risk assessments to also address those ethical issues. Wognut is one of the people that I spoke to, and they emphasized quite clearly that there are newer trends around disinformation, so gendered disinformation. There's also an example in the paper that I give of a report that was done by Her Internet that's looking at on social media systems, how those algorithms continue to have biases against the LGBT community. I won't speak to privacy and personal data. I feel that there needs to be clarity or an expansion in the application on the role of the data protection regulators and examples. So as much as possible, members need to be able to explicitly outline those responsibilities, but it means a little tweaking, of what currently stands. I merged right to development and access to knowledge with the right to information. And within that one, I think what we actually should be doing is looking at more practices or looking at responsible computing or responsible development of technologies so that they are incorporating human rights and the ethical practices that I spoke about. Also in that, there's an example that I give, and I think in terms of just looking at the development of technologies to respond to more economic issues. So there's people coming up with apps that can be used by farmers and the like. So what is it that we will want to emphasize within that section that looks at the guidelines for what we call trustworthy or ethical approaches to AI? Then the last one, obviously, being cultural, linguistic, and diversity. There should be some way where we can look at the application and start looking at the prioritization of voice technology or local language development for public interest technology. So that South African example that I shared with you earlier, I think one of the things is that it's not inclusive and it's not accessible to citizens because of the limitations in terms of the language use. So that paper that I'm going to show, that will be shared with you, has some recommendations for consideration. I agree with Idet that we may not be able to do or look at all of them. Maybe it's an issue of just prioritizing and saying which ones are more urgent. Thanks, Rihanna.
Thanks, Koliwe.
Well, I mean, it seems like Koliwe and myself are in agreement about what the status is and what the issues are. So again, I agree that the declaration is very forward-looking in terms of the principles. Although they were developed at a very specific period, they have tried to anticipate technological development in the coming years. The extent to which it's been successful in doing that, I mean, we can debate that because the truth is that technology is fast evolving, and it's a challenge for policymakers as well, trying to make laws that take into account technology as it's evolving and new threats are emerging from the technological environment. Perhaps we can approach this in one of two ways. One is to say, looking at the declaration, what are the issues that are no longer relevant? And so Koliwe, for instance, mentioned the issue of cultural and linguistic diversity. And there were groups at the time the declaration was developed who were very concerned about the little to non-existence of African languages and culture online. Now, 10, 11, 12 years later, is that still the reality? Have we made progress? And part of the conversation at that time was that some of the response to that would be software development, but there was also a hardware development component to it. So for instance, the keyboards that we currently have are they able to accommodate African languages? So if you wanted to produce content in African languages, would the current keyboards we have enable you to do that? There are some languages in Nigeria, for instance, that have tonal inflections and so on. And I don't see any keyboard that you can use to do that effectively. Or maybe there's some tweaking that can be done. But again, that brings, that puts some responsibility on governments to encourage development of certain technologies that would enable those sort of issues that you say are priority for Africans. We know that for governments, their motivation is often, I think there are really two. One is security, which I referred to earlier, the preoccupation with ensuring security online, cybersecurity in particular. And part of the conversation that is really going on now is how to shape state behavior online, because a lot of states now are using these technologies for cyber warfare, for instance, using it to really do harm. And the UN is grappling with how to deal with that, although they're looking at a process that is largely voluntary. Does Africa have a position on this issue? Because part of the challenge has also been that in those conversations taking place at the UN level, there's very little African involvement in those conversations. So at the end of the day, we may find that when the documents are developed, again, Africa is left behind. So facilitating a process where we are also able to provide leadership and guidance, not necessarily for our government, but for the African community to say, for us, these are the set of things that are important, I think it's something that we need to look at. So the other issue is the new technologies that we've mentioned. Do they create circumstances where we might say that the current set of principles have not covered them adequately? And therefore, we would need to not necessarily come up with new principles, although that may be necessary in some cases, but it may be necessary to reward some principles to make them more expansive, to take into account these emerging technologies. I think that we need to have a dedicated conversation about how we want to proceed on this front. The research has been an aggregation of perspectives from various AFDEC members and a few stakeholders who are not in the AFDEC coalition. But I think if we are saying that we are representing the continent, then we need to have a more inclusive, a more participatory and consultative process of saying what are the priorities for us, how do we identify the range of interest and put them together in a document that responds to the needs of the continent. Thank you.
Thanks, Edith. You literally paved the way for Peace to start her session on, who, how, what, and when, why. So Peace, I'll hand over to you and, to facilitate the next session on what next and how next. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rihanna, for the wonderful session we had. And Koliwe and Edith, I could listen to you for more hours, I tell you. Thank you very much for the insightful and very informative information and conversation that you've given us. Thank you very much. And I think many people might have some reactions to this conversation that we've had. So I think I would like to give an opportunity for anyone who wants to react to what Koliwe and Edith have been saying. Let's just spend a few minutes if anyone has that, and you can raise your hand. Although I see that some people did not rename themselves, if you could just do that so that when you put your hand, I don't think that it's just Elizabeth doing that all the time. Please, you can raise your hand if you have any reaction, any reaction or any comment or even a question that you have. It would be really great. But otherwise, the conversation already put us through and shown us that there are changes that have happened since the declaration was launched. There are trends that have changed, for instance, sophisticated tools that are now used in surveillance, the shutdowns, how it has changed now, the AI that has come very much in place, and how we need to move forward, is a good question for us to ask ourselves. We'll pause a little bit if anyone wants to raise a hand to take a floor, please.
Thank you, and thanks for the really thoughtful input from both Edith and Kuliwe. I can't agree more with what they're saying. I think there are quite a number of issues that need to be explored further, and maybe we should talk more about exactly how, but I agree fully on that. There's one issue that I also want to put on the agenda, and I'm referring here in the African Declaration to the paragraph that says, states shall recognize that universal, equitable, affordable, and meaningful access to the internet is necessary and so on. And focusing a bit on the word meaningful, which is an area that I think we can really explore well. I'm happy to see that at the IGF, there's a grouping, and I'll post the link in the chat in a moment, that's been doing quite interesting work about meaningful access. And I was wondering, and meaningful in the sense that once you're on the internet, you actually need to be exposed to meaningful content, right? That's when we say meaningful, that's the interpretation of meaningful. So of course, meaningful can also have technical requirements, but my focus is on the content requirements of meaning. As an example, there's a project that some of South African organizations, particularly SOS, who support public broadcasting, is currently in a concept format that we hope to do on a continent-wide basis, which is about universal access to public service content in the digital age, precisely about public service content as part of meaningful access to the internet. And really the departure point of that discussion is the Windhoek +10 African Charter on Broadcasting and some of the principles that were in that. And now that broadcasters are moving into the digital sphere, and there may be many, many other different ways in which public service content or public service media, as it's called in the declaration, could execute their mandate. Would that be a useful way, for instance, to give substance to meaningful access? And if there are anybody on this call who would like to get involved in some of the thinking and helping to design a continent-wide consultation process on a framework for universal access to public service content in the digital age, you're really welcome to contact me. Thank you.
Or afternoon. I just have a question, but before I go to that question, Isaac, I'll definitely be getting in touch with you because this was a conversation we had in Lesotho last week when they're trying to promulgate the Computer Crime and Cybersecurity Bill into an act. And the media has been very vocal about their feelings that the clause within which talks to publication of false information and access or illegal access to information, I feel there's still a lot of misunderstanding regarding what that means vis-a-vis in the language that would be used within media. The argument still being they feel that the clause is talking to publication of false information basically encroaches upon their freedom of expression and thereby not understanding that all human rights are not absolute and they all depend on one another. So in as much as one may have freedom of expression, but one may also have freedom to dignity, the right to dignity, to humane treatment, and the right to meaningful access to information, like you just said. So that would actually be something that I'd be really interested in working with you on. My question now is, how do we come and discuss with parliamentarians, as Mr. Ojo said, to make them realize that promulgation of laws regarding digital rights is not something new as opposed to what we've had in our traditional legal frameworks? Because I find that in Lesotho, our main concern is once we talk digital rights excessive, we did not have rights protecting human well-being on the ground. How do we get political buy-in and a language that they will understand? Because most of the time when we speak, I'm a lawyer, most of the time when we speak, no matter how much we try to break down the conversation into a language that could be considered household colloquialism, we find that there's still very, very difficult. There's an immense difficulty in trying to make the parliament understand. And unfortunately, the parliament becomes the most important sector because they're the ones who are responsible for policy making and promulgation of the laws. How do we move from this language barrier that we see, that parliamentarians are still very much uneducated or illiterate, for lack of a better word, with all due respect? And how do we make sure that we fast track? What have your experiences been? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rihanna. And also a big thank to Peace, Koliwe, and Edet for the valuable input. It's just a comment. My concern is just that saying that by evaluating the declaration to take into account new digital technology, we must take into account the specificity of the challenge that Africa encounter in its socio-economic development without aggravating the challenges linked to employability, particularly of young people of working age.
Thank you, Evis. And Koliwe, if you want to respond, and we will give more opportunity to others, and so that we can start to look at what next. What are the opportunities that lies ahead? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Peace. I'll have to hear what I didn't quite get Avi's question, but I think in terms of just dealing with a parliament whose literacy is low, I think the unfortunate part is that most of the people who get into parliament on a popularity contest. That's the first thing. The second, that parliamentarians ordinarily belong to, I like to call them factions or camps. So when I worked on the issue of Southern Africa, one of the strategies that we used to do was to make a power, looking at who is sitting in parliament, identifying which ones of them actually you can interact with so that they are influencing or breaking down issues for everyone else. And what we would find is we literally had to break down the technical language to actually have them understand what we mean by a violation of someone's right when we talk about a media issue. The second thing was language. Unfortunately, we need to come up with fundraising strategies to actually, because you have, Rorisang, you have already identified that there is need for the translation into local languages of policy positions, of breaking down issues. So we can't always take text to parliamentarians. We can't always use a media article, but there are other alternative ways of running a campaign. So if you look at, I think, the broadcasting campaign that was done across the region, but sub-region in Southern Africa, was even going as far as breaking down very simple language. I like to say idiot-proof language. And sometimes it means actually coming up with a diagram that actually shows what the difference is. But I think that's the strategy on power mapping and identifying people who may not necessarily sit in the parliamentary portfolio committee that's working on, broad or internet-related laws, but identifying somebody who can actually speak to them and is acceptable as well. That power mapping also goes back to, it did talked about the civil society as a grouping. So I understand that you'd probably be working with the Lawyers Association or the Human Rights Law Association. But sometimes you're not the right person to do it. Sometimes it's getting people who have been working on, say, if you thematize the issue that you're dealing with, other civil society organizations. And I underline that in the paper. That is when the power of collaboration comes through, because at the end of the day, ultimately, it stops being about the organization that is fronting the campaign. Rather, it becomes about how many of you can actually cross a boundary that you get, or when you meet with lawmakers who don't actually understand the actual law itself. Peace, I didn't hear.
Thanks,
Yeah, I'll touch on that a little bit. But so let me start with thanks a lot for raising that issue. It's actually one of the specific recommendations in my research report, where it was proposed that the declaration should be updated. And that recommendation is that we need to refine the concept of universal access by updating the principle around the issue to reflect the need for meaningful connectivity. And meaningful connectivity is further elaborated, maybe not defined, I would say elaborated in terms of what it needs to take into account. It should emphasize affordability, for instance, the speed of the connectivity, because again, in many countries, we have such poor connectivity that you can almost do nothing except read and send emails with them. It should address digital literacy. Again, if people are not digitally literate, they are really able to do very little online. It should address quality of service. And I think that, again, this is where the issue of public service online and access to those public services would also be relevant, particularly in rural areas and in underserved communities. So there's clearly a realization that we need to update the declaration in terms of going beyond universal access to specifically talking about a lot of issues would relate to what is now referred to as meaningful connectivity. With respect to parliamentarians and parliaments, I'm not sure that the approach would really be different from the legislative advocacy approaches that we've used or are using on a lot of other issues. And I think that, again, this is where we had hoped that the declaration would be useful and relevant for civil society organizations that are engaged in advocacy work, because if you are engaging with parliamentarians or policymakers, it's important that you come from a position of knowledge and that the issues you are pushing are on the right side of standards and principles. So I think that the starting point, of course, would be for all of us to enlighten ourselves better about what the norms and standards are. But going beyond that, I think different countries have different legislative processes, but broadly speaking, in a lot of countries, you have laws that are made through executive bills. These are bills that are proposed by the executive that are usually government driven, but there's also opportunity in other countries for what is called private members' bills, where members of parliament propose laws that are then considered and in some cases passed. The reality is that most members of parliament, especially those that have been referred to as not so literate and all of that, it's very unlikely that they're going to be able to draft bills and present bills before parliament. And I think that that presents civil society with an opportunity, because on the one hand, they want to have a track record of having proposed bills, possibly which became law, because that becomes part of their legacy. But they simply do not have the capacity. And I think we can step in and help them draft bills and let them take ownership of the bills and claim that they drafted it and we support with advocacy. We simply want our issues to become law. They are looking for credit for these issues. I think that we can take advantage of that to bring our knowledge, expertise, and resources to parliamentarians so that those issues become law for us. And we're happy to let them take the credit. So I think that that's a huge opportunity. I do agree with Koliwe about the diversity of the use of civil society. I mean, it covers a wide range of actors. And that is the importance of also working in coalitions, because when we are able to bring together different groupings, we have a variety of expertise and competencies. We would have lawyers, and as Koliwe mentioned, and I do agree, lawyers are sometimes not the best advocates. They might be in court, but in real life situations, they probably don't have the language to talk to us ordinary human beings. So we can look for other people who are better at engaging with parliamentarians, government officials, even civil society. So it's really building coalitions that bring together all of the expertise and competencies that we need. And if we are able to build such coalitions and unleash them on parliament, I think we'll be making a lot more impact. It's almost impossible for one organization to engage with a national parliament and hope to be able to, have a one-on-one or a substantial engagement with a significant number of parliamentarians. So I would also recommend the coalition approach when we engage with parliamentarians if we really want to be effective. Well, Evie's point about identifying specific challenges in Africa, including challenges of unemployment among young people, for us to be able to respond specifically to them. It's a great idea, but I don't think we can respond to each and every challenge. So again, we have to look for broad principles that enable us to establish standards which would benefit the majority, if not everyone. But I think it's important to contextualize that by understanding what the challenges that we're trying to address are. So I agree with you, but I don't think that we can, just try and address every specific challenge that young people and other demographics in society are facing in responding to the issues. I hope I got your question right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edith and Koliwe. I think we had one Elizabeth hand up, but you put it down. Do you want to take the floor? Someone had a hand up, but with the name Elizabeth, and someone left a question in the chat. We have only 5 minutes.
I can help with that. Thanks. The most recent example we've got of that is the consortium that turned around the, moving on or passing of the cybersecurity bills in Zambia. This is from like 2 weeks ago. So you can look at that. You'll find it on the Panos Institute website. The question here is about politicization of digital rights and policies. I think this is a reality that we live with every day. Selective application of the law, sometimes the laws are actually so wide, you find that even the way that we understand is not the same way that the judiciary that Idet spoke about earlier is a priority for them to actually understand what that actually means. So the question for me is, to what extent are we able to deal with the commitment?
We have lost you, it seems. Okay, we have 4 minutes. Anyone? Okay. We lost you. If you can go back to just a few seconds, we lost you a bit.
Oh no, I was saying that I think the main issue is for us to be able to understand what we have right now within the principles section and identify the relevant authorities so that you are letting them see that, hey, there's a problem in the way that this court ruling went. This is how we predict it, or this is how we interpret it. And I find that the only way to deal with that politicization is to just hinge all our arguments on the human rights standards. So it's how responsive are we to those violations or politicizations or application of those specific laws? And what is the option that we are coming up with? So if you're writing a statement, you condemn, but let's have a recommendation that you can always stand by and keep making reference to. I find that there are so many statements that are issued with different positions, but to what extent do they actually carry and hold? And the case studies that we interact with as we are monitoring the implementation of the laws, to what extent can we actually point them to the relevant authorities to say, this is a case of gendered disinformation, and this is the impact that it has on women who ordinarily would have been engaging online? I hope that helps.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Koliwe. I think we have only 2 minutes, so we can't take any other question or thoughts. I just want to thank you so much for making time for this webinar, and a big thanks to Koliwe and Edith and Rihanna. We could just give a hand clap, just to really thank them. Rihanna, do you want to take over from here? Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, everyone, particularly Edith and Koliwe. It's greatly appreciated, but also to Namibia NMT Media Foundation and to APC. This webinar was really instrumental in getting us to zone in and reflect on the birth of the African Declaration on Internet Rights and Freedoms, where it started, what informed it, its effectiveness. It provided insight on how a document like this needs vision, commitment, collaboration, and constant review. And, both Edith and Koliwe, in their work, and when you see their research papers, you can see that it is still very relevant today because of the fact that it was a very visionary document, that it doesn't come just in isolation. It comes on the back of many other policy frameworks. It's about, working together, working, collectively, but over a long-term period. And the key takeaway for me is that even with emerging technologies, including the adoption of AI tools, the 13 principles, which include many things, especially things like the cross-cutting and intersectional issues like internet access and affordability, freedom of expression and access to information, remain relevant as foundational principles. So, and I think what you both did was outline that in addition to effective application, what is needed now is probably an update, tweaking, and that this process, we have to decide on it, this needs to be inclusive, and it needs to broaden, in terms of the stakeholder base. And during this process, stakeholders will have to prioritize the issues to take forward, how they envisage doing that, and the actual process of taking it forward. Those were my key takeaways. Obviously everyone has different ones. And on that note, I can say that, if there's nothing from Peace or Edit or Kaliwe or even from NMT, I'm happy to say it's been an amazing webinar, and I hope that you've all enjoyed it the way we have.
Thank you very much, Rihanna. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.